Okay, hello to all of our listeners. Welcome to all of you. And I'm delighted to be learning together with all of you the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is the taming of desire. Sounds very tantalizing. And we're going to dive right into the sources. I'm going to give a little bit of a background. By the way, we have a source sheet, so please make sure you download it wherever you're viewing this from, because then you'll be able to follow me along with the sources. So this is a class where we're going to talk about the place of desire in Judaism, maybe beauty in Judaism, sexuality. And our starting point seems so innocuous. It seems as if, how would we make anything out of this verse? The topic here is the Israelites building the temple, the portable sanctuary, the Mishkan, which they build in the first year in the wilderness. They receive the Torah from Mount Sinai, and they commit the crime of the golden calf. They get given the second tablets, and no sooner that's happened, they start building an arena where they can actually meet God. It's sometimes called the tent of meeting, or the Mishkan, God's residence. Literally, Mishkan comes from the word Shekhinah. Shekhinah is God's presence, but Shekhinah also relates to the word Shachein. God is a place where God can be our neighbor. The way the Mishkan is built is constructed by materials which are all donated by the people. There are a few compulsory donations, the half shekel, but most of it is a voluntary donation where different members of the community will donate whatever it might be: silver, gold, wood, precious stones, what have you. And out of this, under Moses' instruction, under the guidance of the designers, Bezalel and Aholiav, the Mishkan is built. And here we're going to see one of the items in the sanctuary, which is built with a donation from a very specific group, which we're going to have to identify. And I'm going to read the verse. And it says, Vayas et ha-kior nechoshet. The kior is the laver, or maybe we should call it is a reservoir of water. In other words, essentially, it is, you didn't have running water. Thank God we live in the 21st century. And they had to create a whole container of water with taps so that the priests would be able to wash their hands in order to get ready for the divine service. And this was one of the requirements. They weren't allowed to start the service without washing their hands, the priests. So they have to make this, they're going to make it out of copper, and it's going to be, as I say, hold a lot of water. So they made the kior, as it's known, the laver of copper, and its copper stand, and they make it from the mirrors of the tzovaot. Now that sounds like the word, it's the feminine. And it's a feminine form. Those people who, from the word sava, the same word as sava, army, from the droves of people, and it seems like female people, so the translation will be from the women who gathered at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And it says that from their mar'ot, mar'ah is a mirror. In other words, I'll bring it down to the real translation, which is a bunch of women, we don't know who they are, seem to donate their mirrors to the sanctuary. The question is, why does this bear mentioning? All other things are donated. It doesn't say, and these guys, they decided to donate their, I don't know, golden tea service, right? And these people, they decided to donate their precious jewels, which had been in their grandmother's necklace, right? It doesn't tell us that. Why does it tell us the source? Rashi, the famous commentator, suggests that there is a history here which had to be told. And I'm going to read source number 1 here, which you see, and it says the following: Benot Yisrael haya bi'adan marot. The women of Israel had mirrors. Sheraot bahem kshem mitkashtot. They used to use these mirrors when they put on makeup and they beautified themselves. V'af otam lo ikvimu lehalbi nidvat hamishkan. Women were so generous that even these mirrors, maybe they had their favorite, and they also had a second one for travel, I don't know what, right? And they decided that even these, they wanted a part. This was maybe very, very precious family heirlooms, I have no idea. They donated those two. the intrigue. Moshe not want to accept them because they were made for the evil inclination. But he doesn't really mean anything evil here. What he really means is they were made for sexual purposes. Why would they be making themselves up to beautify themselves for their husbands and what have you? And he felt that something which had a sort of sexual, even a small sexual connotation, was inappropriate for the temple. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God says, accept them. Ki ele chavivim alai min hakol. These are dearer to me than all the other gifts. Because it was due to these mirrors that the women brought myriads into the world when they were in Egypt. Here's the play on words from the Midrash. Sivot, right? There were armies of people who were created by mirrors like this. What is he talking about? And now he takes us into a fascinating story. He takes us into the moment in which the Jewish people are enslaved in Egypt, and we get told at the beginning of Shemot that the men of Israel had to be engaged in backbreaking labor, avodat parech. And he says, when their husbands were engaged in backbreaking labor, they would go to see their husbands, bringing with them provisions of food and drink. They would eat together, and they would hold up the mirrors and would see themselves in the mirror, shitizim, and say, they hold up the mirror, she's flirting with her husband, I'm more good looking than you, right? That's probably true, but anyway. And in this way, they would seduce their husbands and had children, and these are the mirrors that they are talking about. In fact, they quote a verse here, which says, Tachat hatapuach or artich, underneath the apple tree, I aroused you. It's a verse from Shir HaShirim, which they bring as this. And this is the story. And Rashi even adds, it's not in your translation, that the kiyar is very special because it is made to create peace between husband and wife, because when they do the ritual of the sotah, which Rashi sees as a means of allaying the suspicions of the husbands, one of the things was they dissolve a certain curse in the water, the ink goes into the water, and the woman drinks it, and this should allay the suspicions of the husband and create peace between husband and wife. What's the story going on here? Let's just fill it in. I assume that many of our listeners know the story of what happened in Egypt, where Pharaoh is throwing the children into the river. And since you've got a relatively 50% chance of having a boy or a girl, who would want to bring another child into the world? Such persecution, incredible. More than that, I assume that men who are undergoing this backbreaking labor are saying, why should I bring other children into the world who are just going to live an existence of suffering and absolute exploitation, a miserable existence? And here we're told that it is the Nashim Tzidkaniot, those righteous women, that women had faith in the future. Maybe women felt the life force more inside their bodies, and women were the ones the men gave up on creating the next generation, but the women never did. It's actually fascinating. I'm saying this a bit as an aside, but when you look at the opening stories of the book of Exodus, of Shemot, all the heroes are not heroes, they're heroines. Moses, or even before Moses, we have the midwives. If you remember, Shifra and Puah, who are the midwives who defy Pharaoh and help the women to be able to bring life into the world. Then, of course, we have Moses' sister who watches him. Then we have, of course, the daughter of Pharaoh who takes this baby out of the river in an act of political dissent, goes against her father's wishes. And she knows it's a Hebrew child. And she takes the child home and decides this child is going to live. And of course, then the wet nurse is Moses' own mother. We hear about at least 5 heroic women who allow Moses to come into being, which provides the foundation point. So this isn't, and the Midrash is clearly expanding this and saying it's not only these 5 unique women, but it is also all the women of Israel who kept the Jewish people going by having faith in the future, and by actually, when their husbands refused to have further children, they found a way of arousing their husbands to be with them, and that they would get pregnant and have children. These mirrors, therefore, now we understand the controversy of the mirrors. Moses says, what are you talking about? These mirrors were used for sexuality. This is inappropriate in the temple. Okay? And God says, accept that, because this was the key to Jewish survival. Fascinating story. And it's fascinating to think that this water basin contained all this history as part of it. This isn't the end of the story, because there is another opinion. And then we're going to try and take this onto a more ideological plane, to a level which is more about ideas. Ibn Ezra is going to come along with a completely different approach, takes things in the opposite direction. And he says this: Mishpat kol hanashim hityapot lirot pneihem b'chol boker b'marot nachoshet u'zchuchit letachein haparim shal roshehem. He says, women, nothing's changed, now men do it too, right, are used to looking in the mirror, a mirror made out of copper, right, or glass. By the way, now, just a technical thing, nowadays our mirrors have glass and there's some sort of silver behind it, right? In those times, they didn't have glass, which was so sophisticated. They didn't have see-through glass. So the glass was always frosted, like, stained glass and all that sort of stuff. So the best way to get a really good shine was to take metal and shine it up. And I guess silver was very expensive, but copper was cheaper. And therefore, they used copper for their mirrors. So that was why they're talking about copper mirrors. But whichever way, he says they would use their mirror in order to get their headdress into shape. He doesn't talk, God forbid, about their actual hair, right? But he says that was what it was for. And he mentions a verse in Isaiah where we get this from. And he says, behold, he says, there were women amongst Israel dedicated to the service of God who distanced themselves from worldly desire. They donated their mirrors to the Mishkan as they had no further use for beautification. In other words, these are a group of women who, maybe in our contemporary reality, we would talk about, I don't know too much about Christianity, but almost like they lived a monastic existence. They lived like nuns, where they gave up their sexuality, they gave up their beauty, and these women would come each day to the entrance of the tent of meeting to pray and to hear the details of the mitzvot. In other words, he sees these women who abandon the world of marriage, abandon the world of family living. They are so dedicated to religion that they decide they want to remain single, to abandon needs for beauty, and just to dedicate their lives to God. And it's fascinating because the same idea of the Nashim Hatzovot we hear about early on in the book of Samuel. In Samuel chapter 2, we hear about a group of women who are also gathering, and it seems like this was almost a practice to have women who totally dedicated their lives to God. And here, I think, if I can jump to, I think what is really behind this story, to my mind, is the question about whether sexuality, appropriate sexuality, right, has a place in Judaism. Sexuality can sometimes be quite a primal force in our life. Sexuality can be something that we don't necessarily, can't always control. And the question is whether there is a place within Judaism, a place within the spiritual for sexuality. And I think this is what's arguing about. Ibn Ezra is creating a narrative whereby the mirrors are donated because people are discarding them, because the women are donating their mirrors because they've given up on beautification and they've said, listen, it's all about God, and the world of the flesh, the world of physical appearance is something we are abandoning. Rashi, right, brings a story where Moses actually thought that was the case, but Moses got it wrong. Moses had thought, and by the way, it's fascinating because there is a midrash that Moses separated from his wife. Moses had left his wife, and Moses had given up the world of intimacy with his wife. He thought that anything to do with sexuality was inappropriate. God says, no. There is an appropriate sexuality. I want to amplify this by thinking about a couple of things. If you recall that scene before the Israelites get the Torah from God, we have the situation where they are told to separate from their wives. Al tikshu elisha. The men are told, have a 3-day hiatus, purify yourselves, and for 3 days don't approach a woman, indicating that preparation for a divine rendezvous involves a separation from sexuality. Likewise, in later days, what would happen when somebody went to the temple is they would have to purify themselves. They'd have to go to the mikveh, right? And they'd have to leave the world of the sexual behind them and go to the mikveh, and maybe I'll talk about that in a few more minutes. So it's remarkable in the world of Rashi that Rashi is actually bringing a narrative where God sort of embraces and says, no, there is an inappropriate sexuality, but there is an appropriate sexuality. And so I want to focus on this question just for a few more minutes. And if you look in source number 3, you will see a remarkable story here about the death of the Yetzer Hara, the death of the evil inclination. And let me give you some background to this story. It is from the Talmud in Yoma. I think it is page 69 in Yoma. And this is where you will find the story. From the Talmud. Now the Talmud tells the following narrative. You can see it here. It was destroyed in years where the Jewish people had sort of been having a very, very difficult time with idolatry. And the temple was destroyed. The rabbis turned around and said, listen, God, you're not giving us a fair chance. Idolatry is so potent. It's so enticing, right? If you don't help us a little bit, we're just going to, even if a second temple is just created, we've got no chance. We can't fight our evil inclination. Help us a little bit, God. And it says they sat fasting for 3 days and 3 nights, and it was handed over to them. What was handed over to them? The evil inclination for idolatry. Fascinating story. Where was it sitting, by the way? In a most remarkable place. It departed from the Holy of Holies as a fiery lion club. And as the prophet Zechariah said to Israel, this is the inclination for idolatry. And they grabbed hold of it, and one of its hairs fell out, and it raised its voice, and the sound carried 400 parasangs. In other words, this was a very powerful thing, right? I think it's emerging from the Holy of Holies. Actually tells us that there is an interesting relationship between the temple and idolatry. The temple allows God to be very close and very intimate and very present, and idolatry is the flip side of that. It allows something to be present, but something which is not sacred. I'll put that aside, whichever way. The rabbis are very happy. Great, we've got rid of the inclination for idolatry. This is brilliant, right? Now we'll have no temptation at all. And if you turn over the page, right, they said, since this is a time of grace, since God's on our side and he's helping us out, we're already on a winner, right? Let us ask for mercy regarding the other inclination, the inclination for sexual sins, because of course sometimes we mess up. People, look at places they shouldn't look. People, serve to places they shouldn't serve. Right? What are we going to say? What should we do? We're going to get rid. If God's already delivered the evil inclination, the inclination of idolatry, let's get rid of the inclination of sexuality. They asked for mercy, and it was handed over to them with a health warning. And it says, he said to them, realize that if you kill me, the world will be finished. Okay? Oops. So they had a little bit of hesitation. They imprisoned it for 3 days, but when they went to look in the entire land of Israel for a fresh egg, they couldn't find one. They said, what should we do? Should we kill it? The world will be finished. Should we ask for mercy? They don't give halves in heaven, and they blinded its eyes and let it go, etc., etc. Strange story, but I think what the story is saying is very simple. Okay, and I think this backs up the Rashi version beautifully. See, there's this phrase which is used in our tradition called the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and I guess we could read it as the inclination to do evil things. Right? Now, we can argue that there are some inclinations which are totally evil. If I want to, I don't know, steal, right? If I want to be violent, right? You can argue it's totally an evil inclination. But let's think again. That's not entirely true, because one could argue that there is a desire for material possessions. That's a desire which drives big business, right? It also can drive a bank robber. Right? But we have to learn the line between what is licit and what is illicit, what is legal and what is illegal, right? If you understand what I mean, right? We could say, well, there's a inclination to violence, right? Well, that's true, and violence is wrong, but we all know that we would like we need sometimes to defend ourselves, right? And we all know that sometimes when you do have the ability to defend yourself, you have much more confidence, you have strength, right? I remember once somebody telling me how, a friend of mine when we were teenagers, and told me how he trained in martial arts and how much confidence it gave him as a person. And that when you do have that ability to defend yourself, we all value our armed forces here in the United States and America, whether it's in Israel, and we understand that our armed forces act as a deterrent to keep us safe. Violence isn't only something to be used inappropriately, right? It also having, in other words, what I'm saying is, maybe we could argue, and I think Hasidic thinking would argue this, that there's almost no force which is inherently positive or negative. There's a force, but it has to be used for the positive rather than the negative. Back to sexuality, okay? What are they saying? If we get rid of any sexual instinct, the sexual impulse, right? What's going to happen if we get rid of it? Then that's an impulse which can be used in order to drive us astray and to do all sorts of inappropriate acts. But it's also the thing which makes the world. I mean, here they're talking about roosters, and they're talking about the world of creating eggs, but they're saying it's the world of creativity, right? It's also fascinating how sometimes in the world of the arts, we actually do find sometimes art, I don't know, thinking about Picasso or whatever it might be, sexuality and art and creativity. And it's a complex world, because it's very difficult when we have these impulses within us, right? It's not so linear. It's not something that we can necessarily just, as they're trying to do, box it up and, have all the world needs. Once you have a world of creativity and all these things seem to be somehow connected, except, of course, they're given over this inclination to sexuality, and they say, be very careful, and in fact, they put it on hold, and they find, wait, creativity's disappeared, right? The actual inclination on what is sexuality is obviously related to the idea of propagation. The sexuality is the force, and you ask a good, healthy marriage. Obviously, a person will love their spouse and they'll like them for all their wonderful qualities, but sexuality is also part of the glue of relationships, right? And it's part of the mix, which is all of that. So, how are we going to deal with this? And in fact, this is what the rabbis say in Mishnah Brachot, which I put here in source 4. A person is obligated to bless. A person has to say a blessing for the good as well as for the bad. Fascinating. God is the force of good, and God is the force of bad. Everything comes from God. And one of the sources they bring there is the famous line from Shema. You should love God with all of your heart. Now, that's how we always translate it in English, but the word lebavacha is interesting, because you could say b'chol libecha in Hebrew. That would work. What's levavacha? You sense a sort of doubling there. Levav, right? Levavacha. And the rabbis say, yeah, it's true, because you have to serve God b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, with your two inclinations, v'yetzer tov or v'yetzer hara, with your good inclination and your bad inclination. There are some higher sides of ourselves where we'll serve God. That's easy. But it's also, if you want, the lower sides of ourselves also serve God. And that's also part of ourselves. In other words, Judaism does not outlaw sexuality at all. Judaism doesn't have a monastic tradition. Even the high priest is meant to be married. The idea of a chiper, he's meant to atone for himself, but also al beito, and they say, therefore the high priest has to be married. If he's not married, he can't be the high priest. Okay, fascinating, the most holy man. Now, again, I want to stress, here is a very interesting dichotomy. Let me go back to what I mentioned before, the entrance requirements into the temple. You might say sexuality is all well and good, but that happens in our communities, in our home, and it's inappropriate in the temple. There's something remarkable about the temple. The temple is a place where we have to specially prepare to be there. One of the things we do in the temple, we always have to be pure. There's something very interesting. It's a bit of an aside, but I think it might relate to this topic very well. Sometimes we look at, there is tahor and tameh, pure and impure. So imagine everybody would want to be pure, right? Nobody would want to be impure. But actually, the funny thing is, that most of life, a person would be impure. I mean ritually impure. I don't mean we're not talking about my thoughts. I'm talking about in a ritual sense. What do I mean? I'll say most adult life means that we enter into impurity. What do I mean by that? I don't know. Last week I had to go to a funeral, right? You come into contact with the dead, right? It's a holy, sacred thing to be involved in, but it makes you impure. A farmer would maybe deal with animals which died in the herd, right? That's the dead animal makes a person impure, right? A normal part of life. A woman menstruates, becomes impure. A man engages in sex, becomes impure, right? Most of life we are impure. Why would I ever need to be pure, right? Why would I be tahar? There's only one thing to be tahar for, and that's to go to the temple. And I always take this as meaning that when you go to the temple, you actually take a step out of life, right? When we go to the temple, you know, other things we're meant to do when we go to the temple. You're not meant to take your money belt, right? Your money belt, you know, I see that the equivalent of, don't take your cell phone, right? When you go to the temple, don't take your cell phone, because even if you turn it off, you might use it and what have you. Don't take your cell phone, because you've got to be focused on God. Another thing is you don't wear shoes, right? Why don't you wear shoes? So part of it is that sanctity, if you remember that burning bush moment where they were told to take off their shoes. But where do your shoes are there for walking in your field, right? For walking down the street where there might be, dirty. But now I'm going to a pristine place, not a place where I'm involved in, rough stuff. I'm trying to take yourself into a different zone. So it could be, right, that Ibn Ezra is right. The sexuality doesn't have a place in the temple. That's why we go to the mikvah, and that's why when we went to Mount Sinai, we shed our sexuality. And yet, I'm coming back to the Rashi at the beginning. Rashi's saying, no. I'll say something. Even sexuality has a place in the temple, right? Not that we should be sexual, right? But that copper thing, right, is always standing there. And it's fascinating because that copper thing is made from these mirrors. And what does the priest do? He washes his hands from it. He washes his hands. In other words, to say there is an appropriate sexuality. It's now not the moment to be sexual, but sexuality, even that sexuality has a Yetzer Tov, it has a good side, and that has a place in the temple, right? And so I just see that this like fascinating thing that's taking place here when we're talking about these roles of these mirrors, right? I always wonder about these mirrors, and there are different interpretations of what they did with them. Did they somehow melt them down and make them into this object? Or did they possibly take this object, right, this receptacle, and sort of hammer them in, right? Because I guess you wouldn't want to ruin the sheen, right? So I wonder whether they sort of like heated them up and bent them. And so you might even be able to see the outside shapes of all these mirrors, right? And then it really did remind them about that moment, right? Where, can you imagine the priest coming to wash his hands, and he would actually see his own reflection and be reminded of this story, right? And reminded actually that there is a holy sexuality, there is a sexuality which is there to bring the Jewish people there, right? He's meant to be reminded not of his own reflection, but that he represents all of those Sevaot, all of those myriads of the Jewish people, right? And he represents the nation, and that he's there to serve the continuity of the nation. And that would really be taking this mirror moment and making it into something which would raise the consciousness of the priest. And then, again, Moses was nervous. God says, I want it there, right? Fascinating. How does this relate to our lives? It's a great question. Okay, it's a great question. We all grapple a little bit with our sexuality, and we grapple with its place in society. I think we've found a situation in which sexuality, I don't know, certainly through the 20th into the 21st century, has found its way much more into the public space. Sometimes we feel it spills over too much on our billboards and what have you into the public space. It's something we sometimes try and shield our children from, and maybe shield ourselves from, but sometimes it's just like totally impossible. And I think one of the ways to do it is actually, I love this discussion because it's an opportunity for having more awareness about this, about appropriate and inappropriate sexuality and the way it does enter the public space. Are there places where we really would like to put our sexuality at bay? By the way, let me maybe add that we don't have a temple today, of course, but we have what we call a mikdash ma'at, a mini sanctuary, and those are our synagogues. And certainly Orthodox synagogues have found a way of trying to, if you want, deal with sexuality in the synagogue by having a mechitza and having men and women sitting separately, right? And part of that tradition, again, is to say, well, we need to, whether it's in the rest of life, we work in offices where we're in a mixed gender environment all the time, right? But in a synagogue, we want to sort of raise it a little bit. We want to, and that is an interesting tool. I'm saying that mechitza, in a sense, also puts that question into our synagogues. So I just wanted to read, read a passage from Rabbi Soloveitchik, and then look at a picture. And I like using this picture here. You can see it here. It's an Edward Hopper picture. I couldn't resist putting it in. I know somehow it reminds me of New York somewhere along the line. And since I'm giving this class in New York, I felt like putting it in. And I'll explain why I've sort of used it. So I want to just read a passage from Rabbi Soloveitchik, famous Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. Lived in Boston, was the Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University, one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century. And this is what he says, and I think it's quite important in terms of our topic. When God engraved and carved out his world, he did not entirely eradicate the chaos and the void, the deep and the darkness from the domain of the creation. You might remember, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz, God created the heaven and the earth, and it begins, V'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu. The land was one of confusion, chaos and void, v'choshech al pnei tehom, right? And there was darkness on the face of the deep. And then basically the 7 days of creation, what does God do? He sorts it out and takes that chaos and makes it into an organized, ordered world, okay? So Rabbi Soloveitchik says he didn't entirely eradicate the chaos and the void, the deep, the darkness from the domain of his creation. Rather, he separated the complete perfect existence from the forces of negation, confusion, and turmoil, and set up cosmic boundaries. Light and dark, day and night, right? Sea, you have your space. Land, you have your space. Heavens, you have your place. Earth, you have your space. He created order so that we could live. Man is different from the animals, etc. Eternal laws to keep them apart. Now, he says, Judaism affirms the principle of creation out of absolute nothingness. In other words, God created everything. Everything. There was nothing before. Therefore, the chaos and the void, the deep, the darkness, and relative nothingness must have all been fashioned by the Almighty before the creation of the orderly, majestic, beautiful world. So God wanted there to be chaos in the world. And so, how should I say it? Forces, powerful forces, that sometimes are difficult to restrain. However, the forces of relative nothingness at times exceed their bounds. They wish to burst forth out of the chains of obedience that the Almighty imposed upon them and seek to plunge the earth back into chaos and void. It is only the law that holds them back and bars the path before them. What's Rabbi Soloveitchik saying? That God created many primal forces, and I would argue those primal forces were forces of creation, like we said about sexuality, but every force, right? One of the forces that he refers to in this passage in Halachic Man is actually the force of the ocean, the sea, right? There's a famous midrash actually also about the temple, that David tried to dig down into the temple and he found this primordial spring underneath the temple, and God said to him, be careful, don't take the plug out of the spring, and he did, and suddenly the waters gushed out. It was almost as if this is the place of creativity, right? And wherever there's creativity, even holiness, right, there are forces that might not quite be controlled, right? And we have to put a lid on them, right, like a raging volcano, right? And sometimes we could see sexuality like sometimes sexuality does, right? He said, go out of bounds. What will hold it in? Law. That we have certain conventions. It could be law as in halakha, it could be, we all have certain conventions and certain protocols which try and make sure, right? In some places it will be the way we dress, in some it'll be certain protocols which try and ensure that so that we can live life, we can keep our sexuality at bounds and we can use it at the appropriate times. Okay? And that's what he's saying. The idea of law in all regards is to create, I guess, what we might call a civil society. I'd go higher, even a holy society. I mean, again, take other spheres of life, another primal eating, right? It's fascinating. Eating is such an animalistic thing. Animals eat too, right? What have we developed around eating? Oh, perfect dining, white tablecloths, right? Perfect etiquette. Why is it that my parents always used to talk about, how to eat with my knife and fork, in a beautiful way? And what's it doing? It's trying to raise what would be an animalistic act, right, and try and bring it higher. Judaism goes even further. It has laws of kashrut, laws about which foods we eat, and saying a blessing before we eat and saying a blessing after. We take an act which is otherwise primal, and we surround it again with societal convention. And as I say, Judaism surrounds it with all sorts of laws. We are sanctifying the act, right? I would add that in sexuality, the idea of marriage is sometimes called kiddushin. It's holy because we have limited ourselves to a given union, right, etc., etc. We've committed ourselves, and we want sexuality to be within a committed relationship, and all of that. Why did I put this picture of Edward Hopper here? It's called Office at Night. I love this picture. I think I studied it once in a course on history of art. Why did I sometimes when I talk about this topic of sexuality, I like bringing it because I never understood for a long time Hopper's pictures, what they're trying to tell, but they actually tell a fascinating story. First of all, it's called, Office at Night, right? You wouldn't even know necessarily that this is at night. So I guess you can look out and it looks a little dark out the window, but I don't think you would necessarily have noticed it, right? And the strange thing about it is it looks like when you look at it that there's actually light coming in the window, right? You see that? Now, what do you see in this picture, right? You see a man sitting at a desk. He's looking at a paper, and the door's open, and a woman, possibly his secretary, possibly she sits at the desk opposite him, right, is standing next to him, right? Seems totally innocuous, right? But it's fascinating because she's looking at him, maybe, and he's not looking at her at all. Now, the way the light is falling on her, it accentuates certain bits of her body. Even the drawer that she's drawn out is touching her breasts. And it's almost trying to, now, on the one hand, she's perfectly dressed, right? On the other hand, now I want you to notice one thing about this picture, and that is there's something on the floor. A piece of paper, right? You see it? Who dropped it? Now, either he dropped it or she dropped it, right? But here's the fascinating thing. She's looking sort of down, maybe she's looking at a piece of paper, and he's looking dead ahead, right? And it's the office at night. Now I'm thinking, maybe they're the only two people left in the office, right? What exactly is happening? Now, on the one hand, this can be a totally innocent scene. She's coming, she's going to drop it, she's going to pick it, she's going to walk out. That's the end of the scene. Or maybe he's concentrating too hard on his paper because he's feeling something else. Maybe and this sort of gives us this image of a certain sexual tension in the room, right? Which is there, right? When you see it in color, it's even better, right? Where you see this sort of sexual tension in the room of what might be. And I think Hopper knows he's doing this, right? And he's trying to raise exactly this question of, in our urban environments, how there is a latent sexuality, and do we just let that latent sexuality be what it is and keep it out of mind or whatever it is, or does somehow it burst beyond those bounds, right? And of course, this office is not the temple, and the temple is not the office, but what I want to say is that we have this sexuality as part of who we are, and therefore Judaism has to grapple with it, right? And therefore I'm going to try and summarize. We have these amazing mirrors, okay? And for the Ibn Ezra and for Moshe himself, according to Rashi, they had no place whatsoever in the temple. The only time that a mirror had a place in the temple is if somebody was saying, I'm putting my sexuality to rest, right? Because as I said before, the temple is a place where we want the sex thing to be completely outside. We want to be above that. We want to be above our business ethics. We want to be above any distraction. Now I'm just focusing on God. But remarkably enough, Rashi said, no, since the temple is a place which represents so much about the nation, so much about the person, I want an appropriate sexuality also to have a place here. A sexuality which represents the life force of Judaism, which represents the persistence of Jewish women who were determined to use their sexuality in correct ways in order to ensure that the Jewish people continues. And that has to, and God says, I want that to be there. I want that to be there because sexuality can be home. So this gives us a lot of room to think about the world that we're in, what we restrict, what we don't restrict. And it's just a fascinating discussion, which I think is worthwhile having. Sometimes sexuality is something difficult to talk about, and I think actually talking about it with the content of this discussion allows us actually an avenue to be able to think about these things and then apply this in our own lives. So thank you for learning with me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope this has raised all sorts of thoughts. My only regret is that we don't have an open discussion room where we can all sit and discuss, but please feel free to use this class with others, with friends, and to raise the discussion in your communities, your synagogues, and in your families. Thank you very much.